So thanks to everyone for coming.
It was very full.
I project, so I'm just going to shut the door so everybody in the hallway doesn't hear about military units too. Thanks for coming to our presentation, 10 HUT. Does anybody know what 10 HUT actually stands for? I had to Google it. I asked to Google. It's actually an abbreviation for attention. So it's like the fast way to say attention is 10 HUT, which I always thought was, because I was like 10 HUTs? What's going on? But it's actually about attention. That's not why it's the title, it's just the only military term I know. So this is about Encoded Archival Content, Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, which is what EAC-CPF stands for, and the description of complex entities. And in particular, we're looking at the military. I just want to tell you a little bit about the project team, because we actually are a team. Well, Eliot's much bigger face than anybody else's. Not intentionally. The first person that we have here is Eliot Wilczek. He is the University Records Manager in Digital Collections and Archives at Tufts University. He's also a doctoral candidate here at GSLIS. And he and I are kind of the ones who started all this trouble. He kind of caught me one day over coffee and said, what do you think about describing military units? And I said, I don't know anything about military units, but I know a lot about describing stuff. So let's talk. The other person who is not here, but is here in spirit, is Heather Soyka, who is a doctoral candidate and teaching fellow in archival studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She is a GSLIS graduate, so she got her master's degree here at GSLIS, and then went on to Pittsburgh to pursue a doctoral thing. And her research interests, she is actually our military history expert as part of the group. Eliot's military history enthusiast. Heather actually knows about military history. And then there's me, I'm Katherine Wisser. I'm the metadata expert, I guess. Assistant professor here at GSLIS. And co-chair of the technical subcommittee that maintains Encoded Archival Content, Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, and was chair of the working group that created the standard. So I'm really fond of it. And then, the last but certainly not least member of our team is...
Hi, I'm Justin Snow. I am a GSLIS student. I also am the archives assistant at the College Archives. I am a fan of metadata, and Kathy asked me to contribute to this project because I have experience doing style sheet work with metadata records, so that's kind of my component of this.
So it's been really interesting to working as a team in particular, because we all the team members bring a different kind of area of expertise, but an equal understanding of kind of the goals of the project, which has been really great. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about military unit history, just because I'm all about context, and this is a project all about context. Military units history is a really interesting area in which I know nothing about the military. I mean, I know we have got a couple branches, and if you watch NCIS, which I do regularly, the Marines actually are part of the Navy, but not really. And that's about as far as it goes for me. So military unit history actually has a very rich and deep kind of history to it. It's actually a pretty complex thing. The units are living entities, so they have a history, and their history is very important to them. It kind of helps them identify. It's a very precious thing to them. But they're also, existing going forward as well. They're flexible and structured. They're similar to universities. I mean, they're very complex corporate bodies, military units are. And I had no idea until I started getting into this just how complex it can get, because there are brigades and regiments and units and squads and troops, and it's like this huge hierarchy, and they don't always call things the same things even though they are the same things, and they lend each other stuff like people and stuff like that. So it gets really complex really, really fast. Military unit histories are documents, and I have the one here. This is a military unit history, and we'll talk about what you can do with this document versus what you can do with what we've done. But military unit history documents are really important. They're often written from within the unit itself. So they're not always written from outside. It's not like somebody comes along to, let's say, the 2nd Dragoons, who are the people that we're worried about, and says, hey, I'm interested in writing your history. Somebody within the unit is actually charged with writing the unit's history, and it's considered to be a significant task. So I'm not going to talk more about military unit history until we get to kind of the problems, the main point of this, so just a general introduction. So let me tell you a little bit about EAC-CPF, and I teach an all-day workshop on this, so obviously I'm not going to go into detail. But it is an XML encoding language for the description of entities, right? So it describes not records, it doesn't describe stuff at all, it describes corporate bodies, persons, and families. And within that context then makes connections to entities. Aside from, and I just did a little screenshot, so you see pretty XML. Aside from the control section, which is information about the record you're creating, there are really 3 sections. There's an identity section, there's a description section, identities about names, a description section, and a relation section of an EAC-CPF record. So those are the 3 main categories of information that you can provide. And we're going to definitely cover kind of the decisions that we made in light of the complex entity, the military unit. But it's an XML language, and it's highly structural and highly hierarchical. And it's clearly only about corporate bodies, persons, and families. Military unit we described as a corporate body, and that determines a lot of things. All right.
Do you want to, I thought, something about the linking element, like with the relations?
Oh yeah, well it's because it's an XML and it's published on the web, of course you can link a lot. So there's a lot of linking going on, and it's definitely, if you're familiar with the concept of linked data, it's a huge step into the world of linked data in terms of one way in which to structure that information and consciously make links. And I think that EAC-CPF allows you to make meaningful links rather than just links, which I'm a big proponent for meaningful links. Now the 2nd Striker Cavalry Regiment, which I must say I've spelled Cavalry pretty much in every way you could possibly think about spelling that word. I've actually spelled it in my document. Let me just talk a little bit about why we chose this, and the we would be Eliot and Heather, right? They told me which one, and I was like, okay. It is the, let's see, the oldest, they say, so they claim, and by the way, this history, which is the basis of our record, is not a unbiased history of the military unit. They are remarkably heroic, remarkably heroic. But actually, I think they are pretty remarkable. They are the oldest continuously serving mounted regiment in the United States Army. So they're still deployed today. They were deployed first in 1836, and they have been continuously serving through at the time. So they're the oldest. So that was significant. They also have many different engagements and subunits and people. So they're pretty like the epitome of complex in terms of Army units. And it bridges the past, and this is what Heather says, it bridges the past and the present. They're still considered to be mounted. They don't ride horses anymore. They actually ride tanks. But that is still considered to be a mounted unit, which I was like, no way. Yeah, I thought that was great. I was still hoping they were still riding horses. And they also have some really interesting relationships with other entities outside of the Army that kind of gave us a little bit of stuff to chew on from a description standpoint. And there's some dude, and I don't know who this dude is because I keep forgetting his name, but he's supposed to be really important, and he was in charge of the unit at some time. McClatchin or McClatchin. Anybody a military person? He's really famous. He has a Wikipedia page. And so that was it. And whenever I say, yeah, you know that dude, everyone's like, yeah, this guy. And you know, and I have to listen about him for a long time. So, but it's a really good choice because there's a lot of richness here, and there's a lot of information already available about the unit itself. So it's a good choice for us to kind of pick up on for that. So I just want to conclude this introductory session because we really want to talk about some of the problems, and hopefully you'll have some suggestions of ways that we can handle some of the problems that we're having in this by saying that EAC-CPF, the intention here is to try to test out the possibilities of structuring information about a complex entity so that we can do more things than we can with something like a history. So the biggest joke that we have, and this is the big joke among the team, is, so what can you do with this document? Well, you can read it. That's pretty much all you can do, right? You can sit down and you can read the document. Once I get this information into EACCPF, you can do a whole host of different things with it, including generating this document so that people could read it. But you can also manipulate the data in other ways to generate other kinds of documents. And the military, like everything else in the military, their documents are very highly structured and very precise as to the way that they like them to be laid out. So we wanted to go from having just one thing to having the ability to create multiple things. But we're operating in an environment in which we have military historians and military archivists who are very, shall we say, set in their ways, and really are very much attached to this document. And so getting them to like, I know they don't care about the code, but getting them to think about, if I encoded this, then you could do X, Y, and Z has been a really interesting kind of other avenue in terms of metadata. And being a metadata person, I mean, metadata, it's awesome because it's metadata, but that doesn't actually really work outside of this, this building. So that was part of the, you know, trying to bridge that new community. So what we really want to talk about are troubles with encoding and display. And it is a back and forth conversation, and for, it's awesome, come on. I made it stop. I had it going continuously, and we were getting seasick yesterday, so I said, okay, only 5 times. There's really this kind of conversation that Justin and I have, and then we bring questions back to Heather and Eliot about the relationship between how things are in the English brackets versus how we want it to appear online, and also how we want the output to go. So part of the display is, can I regenerate something like this document from my encoded structure? So we have a couple areas in which we're thinking about. First of all, the external variables. One is dealing with military archivists and military historians. We have actually been to the Military Archivist Roundtable, otherwise affectionately known as MART, at SAA, and talked to them a little bit about the project, and they kind of gave us a, wow, okay. And then unfortunately Heather was there, and she can speak military archives, right? So she's like, no, this is what, you know, this is what's happening. And then they started getting really excited because I stopped talking about these things, and they actually started talking military archive speak. So that's an interesting bridge for us, is that those external variables of trying to talk to military archivists about things that they don't necessarily care about, but that they should, without telling them that they need to care about it. There's a lot of challenges to that as well. A lot of military archivists are also military historians, and if you're familiar with that kind of, that's two very different approaches to information, an archivist and a historian. So there's a lot of kind of doubling up that can create some challenges. And EACCPF, I mean, even to the best of the energetic and innovative people in the world talking about metadata languages, often, and I have evidence of this because I'm married to one of them, put people to sleep. So there's that challenge as well. I don't understand it, but apparently it happens. The next issue that we have is really sources of information. I do have this history. It is published on the web. It's a PDF document, and that's great. But it doesn't tell us everything, and in particular, it doesn't tell us things like equipment that's allocated. I mean, there's really important aspects to the description of military units that this document doesn't tell. And as I said, it's not, I mean, it's a narrative history. So it's written, you know, the very brave 2nd Dragoons, you know, took them in one fell swoop, and like that. So it doesn't say, and then we're allocated 50 rifles, or something like, you know, the things that you actually want to be able to record from an archive standpoint, the kind of factual things that you want to be able to record. It does provide you with, and this is something we'll be talking about as one of our huge challenges, with a list of the battles that, back here, a list of the battles that the Dragoons were engaged in, which is really interesting. So it gives us like the Mexican War, which battles they actually were engaged in the Mexican War, which is great. That's really important information. And then it has a whole category called the Indian Wars, Well, that's not actually an official war. It's just, you know, we just went out and fought people until they let us win, right? So there's that kind of issue as well, where they have a list of battles that are actually actions that aren't associated with the war. And if you don't know, by the way, wars also have a very strict hierarchy. There are wars that have theaters, that have battles or engagements, and it's like a, what is it?
Campaigns.
Campaigns, and then there are battles and parts of campaigns, but there are also battles that aren't parts of campaigns, they're just battles. So it gets infinitely complex. So this is another kind of bit of information. Their sources of information aren't structured as nicely as I would like them to be. So that actually translating that information into a structure is a little bit of work. And to a certain extent, as I'm doing it, I'm making some assumptions based on not fully knowing about military history. So I'm constantly having to go back to my experts and say, so what's going on here? Why is this like this? And I must say, thank God, and I cannot believe I'm actually saying this sentence, thank God for Wikipedia, because it actually told me where Cerro Gordo was and when it actually happened. So I could actually include that information. That is a battle in the Mexican War. Who knew? So that's been a big issue. There are documents that are called the TOE and the MTOE, which are, let's see, the TOE is the Table of Organization or Equipment, and the MTOE is the Modified Table of Organization and Equipment. These documents basically provide authorization for the equipment that is allocated to military units, but actually acquiring that for this particular military unit is not an easy task, right? It's in a military archive somewhere. And actually finding it has been a bit of a challenge. So I think the sources of information problem is actually a pretty interesting one, because yes, we want to describe the 2nd Dragoons, but we're more interested in actually what's so hard about this. And that's one of the things that's very hard about it. And I'm going to turn it over to Justin, and he's going to talk about some other more codey things. I'm going to get out of the way.
So CPF is not, it's a great schema, but as Kathy said, it's for corporate bodies and families and people, and not specifically for military units. So there's a lot of complexities with military units that does not fit easily into the schema. There's, I mean, you can say, like, let's say the unit was deployed in Barcelona or something like that. You can put that in there with their little place tag, but for the most of our other description, that's not narrative description that's kind of found in here, we want to parse out data, such as the equipment that was used, or the awards that were won, or the battles that were fought, that sort of thing, and make that kind of isolated data, which is part of the reason we want to create a record like this. And most of that ends up going in the local description element, which is not very helpful. All you can really do with the local description element is say what it is and what you're describing. Like, you can say it was a Medal of Honor and that's an award, and that's it. You can't really create any hierarchy, you can't do any relations, you can't do any linking. It's basically just a list of local description elements that is not very extensible, that's not very useful for anybody who wants to look at the record or use the record. So that's kind of frustrating. Let's see. Yeah, and so the order of the elements as well. When we create a record, we kind of just we encode all the information in there, and then there's, that's kind of the back end. And then the front end, you have it look a certain way, but apparently military archivists and military historians are very specific about how they want to look at their data and how they want to read their data, and what the data means to them. So in terms of like labeling the data that you're encoding and the presentation, it's very,
Persnickety.
They're very persnickety, exactly. So it's hard to know exactly what your audience wants beforehand. And just like giving this to them, if they see it in a different way than they're expecting, they kind of like bristle up and they're like, this isn't what I want, so I'm not even gonna bother looking at it. So we need to be There's a lot of communication that's involved with figuring out what they want and how to make it look like what they want.
So it doesn't look too foreign.
Right,
Because otherwise they'll
exactly.
reject it.
Yeah, we want them to, I mean, part of the reason we're doing this is for them, to help them to say you can do more with what you have, and if they don't like it, then that's kind of defeating the purpose of what we're doing. So, as Kathy said before, there's like 3 main chunks of where you put the content of the entities, and since there's a lot of relations involved, let me back up for a second. So the description section of an entity is kind of like the bulk of the content that you're putting in there. It has the awards, it has the narrative, it has the dates and all sorts of stuff. And then the identity, which comes just before the description, is very sparse. It's like a name and time and that sort of thing. But then there's relations, which is people who are involved. You can take them out and kind of isolate them as well, the way you would with a place or an award or something, and say this person did this very specific thing at this specific time at this specific place. And you can then have that sort of relate to other places and times, or other people, or other entities. And that's obviously a good thing, but the difficult thing with encoding something like this, so this the oldest continuously serving mounted regiment in the United States Army has gone through a lot of name changes. They've gone through, their history is multifaceted. And so with the CPF record, we have taken each name that the unit has gone by. Like currently they're called the 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment, but they've gone through like dozens of different names over the past 100 or so years.
Actually, a dozen.
Yes, a dozen, yes. And so the way that works in the CPF record is each of those, or the way our decision was to take each of those names and a specific timeline of when they were known by that name and give that one entity. So we have that entity that has a description and a timeline and relations and whatnot. But then that's kind of like, those are isolated chunks. And there's no easy way within a CPF record to kind of combine all of those and talk about that, all of those units, or they're not really units, what are they? I mean, it's the same unit.
Yeah, they're instances of the unit. So, and the reason that we decided, okay, so the military historians and the folks who, the 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment, consider themselves to be the oldest continuously serving mounted regiment in the United States Army. But it actually has 12 different identities. If you're thinking about it from the metadata perspective, it's actually 12 different things, not just one, but they think of it as one. And so we could have created 12 different records and linked them together, or we could have created one record and identified the 12 identities within it. And we chose the latter so that we could say, yes, here's the one record for the Dragoons, which is their nickname, the 2nd Dragoons. The problem there is that there's some stuff that is relevant to the unit as a whole. And we have some examples of that. And there's no way to do that with these 12 different identities in one record. We can't say identity number 1 is unit as a whole, and then identities 2 through 13 are unit over certain periods of time. It doesn't work that way. So that's a big issue that we're really struggling with, and particularly with relations. I think, and actually we wouldn't be able to do that even if we did 12 different records.
And part of the problem too is that they don't even, there's no official name for this regiment. Like they don't have one name that they refer to themselves as, or that historians refer to themselves as. The 2nd Regiment is like a nickname. There's nothing official about it. So that makes it even more difficult to talk about this regiment as a whole, even though the historians are very clearly think of this regiment as a single unit.
Right. It has 12 different names.
Right.
Right. depending on what it was in given time. Yes, sir?
I was just thinking, so that's, so there's no real equivalent of, like, say, a uniform title?
No.
Okay, so
Nothing like
there's nothing really that you can, have you ever thought of just sort of making one up on your own just to be able to link those things together?
So like creating a work record or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, and, I mean, you could do that, but that's not really reflecting an entity that exists, right?
Right.
So it's that's an interesting, actually I hadn't thought about that. You could do that. No, that makes me really uncomfortable. But it's definitely something that we're struggling with because there is regiment-wide, no matter which name it's under, information. For instance, what is their slogan? Which you've been seeing, it's always ready. And that's their slogan, and it's continuously their slogan. It's always going to be their slogan. And we can repeat it in every identity or not, but we don't have any way to get it in there if we don't. And we have some other examples of things that are problematic.
Yeah.
And there's also, I mean, if you think about the regiment, so the relationships that we have included are for Medal of Honor winners, which, by the way, they won a lot in like the 1870s and haven't won any since. I don't know if that's like a pattern for military awards or something like that. So they have listed out the Medal of Honor winners, and for each identity, when somebody within that identity won the Medal of Honor, I've made a relationship to that person. But the intention is, of course, to then have an EAC-CPF record for that person, and then we can make that link. We don't have the EAC-CPF for those people. And if you think about the number of people that are associated with a military unit, the unit itself has had 75 different colonels. So literally we can make relationships to 75 people, plus that McClacken guy or whatever his name is, who's really actually probably would have an EAC-CPF record. Plus whatever the 2nd Regiment, whatever part of the hierarchy in the U.S. Army that the 2nd Regiment exists in as well. And I actually intentionally didn't do structure or genealogy, which you can do. You can do, that's an element in EAC-CPF, because I was thinking I would have no hair left in my head, because I would just be like, well, I don't understand this information. And it's also very difficult to track down that information from us and over time. Because there isn't just one hierarchy. It doesn't exist in one place. And as I said, military units, they lend each other like troops. Say like troop B, go over there, and now you're part of that group. And how do you deal with that, from a metadata standpoint? So the relations actually becomes really complicated.
Yes. Even in terms of like display, so there's all this description that you'd want to include about the relation, but that doesn't really fit easily into the narrative or description of the unit itself. Like it's hard to have those two different things that you're trying to describe at the same time and display both of those things and have that content be accessible for the user while still making one of the biggest problems, actually stepping back for a second, was in terms of the display, was knowing that these military historians are not the most tech-savvy people and are kind of used to very specific things. So making web presence for this record was difficult, to try and have all this different type of information that you want to display to them and let them have access to, but have it not be too fancy. Not that I can really do anything too fancy anyway, but like having those relations that doesn't fit easily into like the overall structure of the unit history.
Yeah, I mean, we want to show them what's possible without scaring them.
Right. Exactly.
So because I think that they can be real. I think they are really creative people, and I think that they just don't know what we can do once we have the data structure. The last kind of thing that we were going to bring up, and then we're going to show you a record because we actually have something to show you, is the unresolved issues. And we have a couple of unresolved issues that we kind of jotted down. The first is this issue with hierarchy and description. So we were playing around with the idea of associating particular battles as being parts of particular wars. But you can't do that using the local description element. You can identify local description local type equals war, And I can even assign an ID to a particular war. So I think the Mexican War is like MW War or something like that is the identifier. But I can't say then with a particular battle that this is part of that MW War. There's no way to kind of link it back in there, which is a flaw in EAC-CPF, which, trust me, I will be bringing up. So that was really a struggle for us because we do want to be able to reflect the hierarchy, and our solution, which is a really not great one from a metadata standpoint, is to put them in order. Like actually to, put the Mexican War first and then list all the battles, and then put the next war and then list all the battles and that. Because that then Justin can say, from a display standpoint, find this information and indent the battles under the war that comes before it. But there's no way for the data to say this war floating out here, this battle floating out here is actually attached to that war. Which is, from a metadata standpoint, you want that explicit. You want that identified. And you can't do that. So that's it. We haven't figured out what to do yet about that. Another unresolved thing, we talked about the description as a whole, but the other descriptive elements are tough. In particular, there's something like, there's a letter that's part of the narrative. And I actually put a comment in the code saying, ugh. Like I encoded it and was like, I don't like this at all. So we need to figure it out. And I guess we could show them. That might be easier.
I don't know where it is, but I can try and
I can find it in here, so then we'll know which identity it is. This is our record. It's a little bit later. And this record now is about 3,000 lines long, and it's nowhere near complete. So it's a work in progress. Where's the letter? It's in the it's going to be in that big long identity. The one that's 1862 to 1939 or 1941. Yeah, it's in here. Interwar years. Keep going.
Oh, here it is. So, all right, so all this content that you're seeing, yeah, these are all just paragraphs, and they're encoded as paragraphs. And then we have this letter here, which is very helpful information. This whole thing is the letter, and each line of the letter is just encoded as like another paragraph, which is not helpful at all. I mean, it works, it gets the job done, sort of. You can't really do anything display-wise with it other than show it as it is.
Right, there's nothing that sets it off as a letter, as a transcribed letter, which is, it's yucky, right? Because it doesn't do anything except for, well, all you can do now is display it as paragraphs. So it's a step up from being able to just read it, right? But we want to be able to identify it as a transcribed actual archival object would be great as part of this history. But we can't do that yet. We haven't figured out a way to do that. Let's see. Oh, and there's another, maybe you'll guys, all right, so there's a drink associated with this unit. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this drink, and I stole some of these, I think probably Candy print out here.
Oh, was that one of mine? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Added a nose page.
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
I didn't need it yet.
So there's a drink here. It's a historic regimental punch, mix, and ceremony. And it's one bottle each of cold duck, that's champagne and red wine, rye whiskey, tequila, Kahlua, Southern Comfort, Evian water, 2 sharp non-alcoholic beers, dry ice, Bacardi's rum, some kind of Bordeaux, Rhine wine, Napoleon brandy, vodka, and slivovitz.
Every place they served? What?
It is.
So I have a list here, so I kind of know.
Yeah, so they say that the dragoons wore an 8-pointed star as a cap ornament, this is when they were first founded, which now forms the background of the regimental crest. The palmetto leaf superimposed on the star symbolizes the 5 years the dragoons fought in the Everglades. That's where they first started fighting. And swamps. Pour 1/2 of a bottle of champagne and red wine over dry ice in commemoration of their baptism in battle. 1 year after the Seminole campaigns. I mean, they have a whole story associated with why each one of those ingredients belong. I'm looking for the 2 sharp non-alcoholic beers.
Well,
Let's see.
it's a
where-
long time to have a non-alcoholic beer.
Yeah, tequila is for the 14 campaigns fought in Mexico. Kahlua is added for Captain May's headlong charge into the blazing Mexican artillery at the Resaca de la Palma. Southern Comfort is for stuff during the Civil War. Then there's more champagne and red wine. The Bacardi's rum is from the Spanish-American War. The Bordeaux is from World War I. Napoleon brandy from World War II. I don't see the sharps. Oh, here it is. Flexibility and versatility are trademarks of the 2nd Dragoons, and the regiment once again proved it in Haiti. As a member of the multinational task force, the regiment had driven more accident-free miles, ate more dust, and drank less beer than any other unit in recent memory. To commemorate our Haitian experience and the 2 beer limit, add 2 sharp non-alcoholic beers as the next ingredient. And then their last line is, now for the hardest job of all, to drink this punch. We really want this in our record, like in the worst way. Because what a bunch of really creative and fun people, right? I have no idea how to encode that or where to encode that, because it's about it's a general bit of information about the unit as a whole unit rather than as part of the identity. So do you want to show them the display of our record? Talk a little bit about the decisions that you made, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
It's not too fancy, but right away
It's pretty fancy.
up here is information about the sources, like links to where the information came from, and then the relations, which is just a list of all the relations that are found throughout the entire regiment and described in that way.
The sources in particular is important, so the military historians don't think that I went off and wrote up a history. It's their history. I literally retyped it.
Yeah, that's something that's very important to them, is where the information came from.
Right.
So that's kind of at the forefront. And these on the left is the timeline, and these are all links. These are the different names that the regiment went by over the course of time.
We have a little overlap. To fix that.
Where?
Right here, between these 2.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I'll fix
That's
it.
only
My
here.
error.
And so let me see, like, I'm gonna find one of the battles. All right, so these are the colonels. Like, there's not really much to do other than just display a whole list of them.
You just passed some engagements.
Oh, all right, so engagements. These are engagements that, I don't even remember which, the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment was a part of.
Yeah, it's this one.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, as good as it can get. Unfortunately, there's no linking there, and it's really frustrating. Like, I mean, when you see it on a web page like this, it's not that bad. But from an encoding standpoint, having that be based completely on the encoder and very prone to error and not any way to fix it or check it to make sure it's correct is it's kind of scary.
And I would say that, this project is very much a work in progress. So one of the things that I started, because when I was working on the Mexican War, was like, okay, so if I go to Google, if I go to Wikipedia, I can find out exactly when this battle actually was. So I can actually add that to this local description. I can put in date information or place information. And so then I got into this like black hole of being very precise about everything about it. You should see like what I've done to my documents. Like, this battle goes here, and it was in this place actually, and oh wait, they're disagreeing on Wikipedia. So I don't want to get it wrong, and I also don't want to presume to say I know what the history is, because these are things that are debated. But I was like, I have to, I'm a metadata person, so I want it to be in order, and I want it to be right and accurate. And so that's kind of an interesting, also additional problem that we face. Kurt, you have a question?
Why isn't Tatum there twice?
Probably because I put it there twice.
They
I don't know.
Well, I know some of the Civil War battlefields there were a couple that were fought later on. They
Right.
returned to the same battlefield, so
So the date information would be crucial there, and I'm just checking to see.
Well-
if you-
either the data information or, I think for Manassas, they're generally referred to as First Manassas and Second Manassas.
Which is not actually how that's referred to, and they were, no, they weren't in both Manassas. They were only in one Antietam. According to this document, it's all according to this history, which is an official history. It comes from the military, the Center for Military History. So I'm, going to the officials on this one. But at the same time, I mean, this is not done, obviously. And there's a lot more work to do.
That's an interesting contrast between it's this history, which is all full of we were the heroes of the day, and yet you're reluctant to engage in any of the external sort of confusions about whether this or that. I can see
Right.
why, but it's an interesting dissonance.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think what we would rather do is say there is some dispute here. And there's actually a couple of people that are recorded in here as Medal of Honor winners who are not actually listed as official Medal of Honor winners, but they count them in this document because this was written by somebody from the 2nd Stryker Cavalry. So it's not, they're not talking about all the things that they really screwed up, if they did, in any case. Like, oops, we did, friendly fire, or something like that. That isn't mentioned in this document at all. There's also a relationship, if you go down to a little bit further, the 2nd Cavalry Group Mechanized one. There's a couple of relationships here which are pretty interesting. So in locations, there's actually a little bit of description. They liberated this town twice, actually, in World War II, and they actually have a little story about that liberation. And I had to decide, okay, do I put that with the place or do I actually add that into the narrative? It's not actually part of the narrative of their history. So I put it under the place because I can do that. Because you can describe in 5 different ways something. But then you can't do things like connect engagement. So I put it in the place thing. And so now there's like 2 different kinds of description. And I'm wondering how well that'll go over and people will understand what is actually going on there. Because this is the story of how they liberated Lunda.
But they're expecting this to be chapter and verse of that. Are they?
No, not necessarily. We are using this document so that we can say, look, we used your document. But we want to give them slightly different looks so they can think more creatively. And if you go down to relations, there's a relationship in here too.
All the relations are up in here.
Oh, all right, yeah, so the Spanish writing school,
good.
they have a
Yeah,
very
Weapons
special
Honors,
relationship
yeah.
with the
Right.
Spanish writing school.
And I think that was actually in a movie.
Yes, they made a movie out of it,
Yeah.
definitely. And that's that white horse thing.
Oh, there it is, Miracle of the White Stallions.
Yep. It's all, I literally took it verbatim from this document, which I'm now a very good typist. So any other questions about this? So it's been a really fun project to work on, in kind of frustrating ways sometimes. We have no idea what Charles Reed actually did. Apparently I decided to leave that out.
Are those in elements at the very bottom under history, that just above, no, stop.
Those?
Yes, those.
They're chronologies. They're set in a chron list. And so I basically just created chronologies to say when somebody became colonel of the regiment. I've done this with publication lists as well. In a finding aid, we wanted to list the publications in a chronological order of the provenance of the collection. In particular, any translations and when translations came out. And I just put it in a chronology so that you could do date and then the title and how it was published. And it actually was a really nifty way to present that information because it's contextual, but it's not actually, those publications aren't necessarily within the collection.
But you slip these 2 chronological statements in at the end of the previous to the one at the end of the mechanized 2nd Cavalry Group, right? Because that occurred during that. Those 2 events occurred during that period.
Yes.
So didn't the second one also occur at the beginning of the next one, in a way, or preceded it? I mean, isn't it also part of the chronology of the second one? Of the
Well,
one
he's
underneath? He's still there, exactly.
Yeah, if you go down to
So is he still there in your?
in
No,
1947,
so, okay, right.
the kernel changes.
So there's a carryover.
There is a carryover, and do you think that we should,
No, but I
Carry
think
that over?
if you're describing in this way each individual regiment, one looks at the chronology and looks at it as a non-metadata expert and goes, oh, look, it's the people who were blah, blah at the time, and it's not really, it's the two events that happened during the time.
I mean, I could definitely carry over, so who's regiment, who's colonel at the beginning of this time period, and then he's colonel.
Right. Perhaps sort of third way through or so. But is that interesting or not? Would that be of interest to someone looking at this or not?
I don't know, y'all tell me.
Not military historians.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the way that they have it here, and this is, if we had decided to just describe it as a single unit, they literally have just a list.
The list, yeah, like it's on Wikipedia, it's a big list of.
Right.
Yeah.
And if I wasn't worried about the identity structure, then I could, all my problems would be solved, right? I'd have a single history with a single list. But these are actually official names that were assigned this unit by the Army. So that was like the first big decision that we had to make. And the minute that we made that decision, then it actually made us have to choose a whole bunch of other things.
Cascaded a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, and maybe it was the wrong decision, because now I don't know how to get that drink in there. Although I don't know how I would get that drink in there anyways, but, yeah.
So I'm guessing that this document was written between 2006 and 2011?
I would think so. It was written in a very surprising, 2011 was the last time it was revised.
Okay, so that's why you chose the main title to be 2nd Cavalry Regiment in that way?
Yeah, that was kind of like a last minute decision that I made like a couple hours ago.
Okay. All right, and I noticed that there are some names like 2nd Cavalry Regiment and 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment that overlap entirely, like 2006.
Oh, these two?
2011.
Yeah, that's just, that's an error.
Oh, okay, all right.
But you'll notice that there, I think that it's interesting you point out a couple of things. So like they insert the word striker and sometimes, or armored, and this means mechanized. So the Army actually changes its own naming structures whenever it needs to. And we wanted to be able to reflect that without saying, okay, but it's really, this is the latest name is the official name. Because it's not actually the official name. In 1836, the 2nd Regiment of Dragoons is the official name.
And the striker refers to the tank.
Yes,
Right.
Ah, okay.
a striker is a kind of tank.
And some regiments are strikerized.
Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I did. It has been a really interesting education.
Really, I know.
And fun to play around with. Well, one, it's fun to find out why my standard stinks. Like what problems there are in the standard, and what it doesn't do well. And something, I mean, from my perspective, this is the most complex entity I've ever considered describing. And it's complex in so many different ways that I have so many things that I can't resolve. And then, on top of that, then we have this external audience that Justin is basically slave to in terms of display, and he and I have to come to some consensus about how we're going to make this work so that I can encode it in such a way that he can manipulate it in such a way that it will display in a way that they will receive. And it will make sense.
Which is very ad hoc.
Yes.
You make it sound very ad hoc.
Well, it is. It is very.
It's not supposed to be though. Like that's not normally the
No.
approach taken.
Well, I
There
don't
ain't
know
always
though.
gonna
I
be a
mean,
Kathy and a Justin.
yeah, this is the first one.
Yeah.
And isn't the first one always fraught with peril?
But aren't though, I can't think of them offhand, but I can't imagine there are not other cases where some of the big things you run into that you hadn't anticipated in creating the standard are going to be things that you'll run into in other circumstances as well.
Yes, I would say if you're dealing with an entity as complex,
Right.
and I'd argue that it would have to be a corporate body entity,
Oh, yeah.
because corporate bodies are, they
People
create
don't
all
do that.
sorts of problems.
Right.
I mean, people are messy, but we're messy and discreet. And this is completely indiscreet.
Indiscreetly messy and discreet.
Right, yes.
Truth be told would be a good example.
Right, we are messy, but we're not as messy
Yeah.
as when we get together with other people over time. with the under name.
But for corporate bodies, I mean, I can see lots of cases where this would be, these problems would be encountered again.
Well, and I would think just like trying to describe a university
Yeah.
is, you know,
An
is a
old
mess.
university particularly. Or a country.
Mhm.
For the name changes, is there how does CPF deal with aliases or corporate name changes?
We have, there's the ability to identify the authorized form, which would be the form designated from the Army, versus variant forms of names, like the 2nd Dragoons. I mean, that's their nickname. There's ways to include that in there where you can say this is a variant form of name. And we can actually manipulate that. Once I've identified that, then Justin can manipulate it to display it.
But even that, at that level, it's like, it's still the name variant
The
of
whole thing.
the unit at that time.
Right.
Like, the 2nd Regiment of Dragoons had a name variant of the
Right.
2nd Dragoons. But then when they were in the 2nd Regiment of Riflemen, they didn't have that name variant anymore. So it's like,
They were
it-
Dragoons.
Or there might be some true for the whole thing and some only true for individuals
right,
of the regiments'
yeah.
names. Who was your famous person? Because I swear it's not on the,
It's
it's not on the black one,
McCracken
something
or
like that is not on the Wikipedia
Robert,
page.
he's an Iraqi guy. Iraqi, the first one. Thank you.
Thanks for remembering.
The first, McCracken, I think his name is. I don't know, I left all of my stuff at home, of course.
That's all right.
Because this is what I do on the weekends. When I'm watching, you know, bad TV.
It's not bad.
It's McCracken. Robert McCracken or Cracken, I don't know, whatever his name is. Ellie and Heather are gonna, you know, just be like, I can't believe you forgot his name again. Well, that's it. We just wanted to share this with you. Thank you for coming and have a great, what day is it? Tuesday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, and we have to go to our questions.
There's a dog.
Oh,
The logo.
There's nothing like the internet.
You didn't.
There is nothing like the internet.